researcher and a practitioner of online education, it's natural for me to automatically go to the community of inquiry theoretical framework when considering those theories and frameworks that impact the field of online education. I want to share with you a little bit about this theoretical framework and its impact on research. I want to start first with the background of this particular process. When created, there was foundational reasons that motivated the authors to discover and come up with some of the components of this theoretical framework. The base goal was to connect human issues around online text-based communication. At that time, online education was almost purely all text-based. In 1997 and 1998, all the way up through 2000, there was very little video. And at that time, they were also hoping to conceive and begin to deliver a new online graduate program. They were sort of at the foundation of it all and was hoping to fully understand the components of that online education in order to be successful in the creation of this new program. When doing this, they had some distinct goals they wished to achieve. First and foremost, as we mentioned earlier, they wanted to connect human issues around online text-based communication. However, there was more to it than that, and there still is today. In addition, they sought to discover teaching issues that were associated using this mode of education. Also, overall cognitive goals of graduate programs were explored in the hopes that these things would be fully understood so that they were able to piece together all of the components of an online educational program. When they did this, they were able to discover a series of presences that existed in most online programs. In this discovery, they found some similarities, some themes, and through that, they labeled the presences as such: social presence, cognitive presence, and teaching presence. These three became the foundation for this theoretical framework. In addition to this, in order to be able to be successful and to dive as deep as they possibly could into this research, they needed some funding in order to be successful. They were provided by Canadian Social Sciences and Humanities funds for this research project, which lasted from 1997 all the way to 2001. So they were able to fully explore this in depth. They actually said in the beginning of their research that they didn't expect it to go very far for it to be successful, but were shocked when they found that it took off. And part of that was due to the fact that they were allotted the time they needed in order to research this topic thoroughly and come up with some strong foundational background to this information. The seminal paper that resulted in this research is entitled Critical Inquiry in a Text-Based Environment, Computer Conferencing in Higher Education. Again, this paper was based on the idea of text-based communication in an online program. Today, things are quite different, but the components, the presences that are mentioned still remained very much the same, with some few additions that are going along with it. So to add to this, I want to share with you a little bit of the foundation for the reasoning behind each of these theory components. Many people believe that constructivism was the basis for this theoretical framework. Some of the authors have a little qualm with this. They feel that while constructivism is definitely a thought, a part of the process, it was not the foundation. Constructivism shares that we construct knowledge through experience and reflection. While that is a part of online education, this inquiry-based learning is takes a different route. And so they wanted to take away from the foundation of constructivism and instead look at some of the distinctive scholars that participated in this research, that motivated and encouraged this research. A few of these that looked specifically at computer conferencing are Henry, 1991, Newman et al., 1996 and 1997, Gunawardinya, 1995, Hiltz and Turoff, 1993. So these were major factors. These were big proponents of the computer communication of inquiry framework. In addition to that, scholars in linguistics and communications were a major part of this as well. They looked at Schaaf and Danielewicz in 1987, and more scholars throughout the next 10 to 15 years after this was published have begun to incorporate their own perceptions and their own components of this particular idea, of this framework. In addition, other pieces of the ideas sort of included themselves within the components of the theoretical framework. For one, Lippmann was able to encourage the name. His writing in 1991 encouraged the name Community of Inquiry Framework. Because of that writing and that research, they were able to formulate the title, the descriptor of this particular theoretical framework. And as most people in education know, John Dewey is a heavy presence in a lot of research nowadays, especially in the field of education, and online education is no different. There are a lot of components of the cognitive presence that is discussed in this theoretical framework that is based in John Dewey's research. A little bit about the gurus of this particular theoretical framework starts with one of the main people that have published the most about this particular topic, and that is Dr. Randy Garrison. He was the Associate Dean and Coordinator of the Master of Continuing Education at the University of Calgary, but then later became the Dean of Extension at the University of Alberta. He has published a series of books that are so much related to this particular theoretical framework. Thinking collaboratively, learning in a community of inquiry, teaching in blended learning environments, creating and sustaining community of inquiry, educational communities of inquiry, theoretical framework, research and practice, e-learning in the 21st century, an introduction to distance education, understanding teaching and learning in a new era, and blended learning in higher education, all of which have made their way into offices and into classrooms. These are a few that I have picked up and I find very helpful reads. In addition, he was awarded the 2009 Sloan C. Award for Most Outstanding Achievement in Online Learning by an Individual, and is now the Director of Adult and Distance Education at the Faculty of Extension. He was not alone, though, although he is the one that put forth the most research in this area. He did have some partners, especially with the seminal paper. Those included Walter Archer, who was previously the Director of Adult and Distance Education at the Faculty Extension, Terry Anderson, who was the Director of Academic Technologies for Learning at the Faculty of Extension, and is now a Professor Emeritus and former Canadian Research Chair in Distance Education. And he actually has a blog that he uses quite regularly in order to present information that is connected to distance education as well as some other factors. In addition to that, the authors of the original seminal paper give a lot of applause to Liam Rourke, who was a master's student and then later doctoral student of Dr. Garrison's when he was researching these components of the presences. He has been applauded as a highly regarded researcher and very helpful in that particular area. So these were the gurus that sort of made up the whole process and helped to develop some of the key terms and ideas that were associated with the community of inquiry. So what is the community of inquiry? We've seen the background, we know who developed it and some of the reasons for developing it, but what is it really? The nature of educational transaction was the focus. They wanted to see that connection between human interaction with text-based environments. So they were looking at that transaction and how things interacted. The goal was to define, describe, and measure the elements of a collaborative and worthwhile educational experience, keeping in mind that they were trying to develop a program, a graduate program of their own. So the goal was to define, describe, and measure something that would be worthwhile and useful and show the rigor of what online education could be. So there was an interaction of presences that was discovered through this research, as we mentioned earlier. And these presences came through three distinct areas: social presence, cognitive presence, and teaching presence. So let's quickly look at what each of those mean. And as you can see, they intersect and impact each other. Starting with cognitive presence. Cognitive presence is defined as the extent to which the participants in any particular configuration of a community of inquiry are able to construct meaning through sustained communication. So in cognitive presence, you are looking for, as Dewey said, quality of critical discourse and thinking. So oftentimes there's connections made to course objectives, to the way in which lectures are delivered and retained through quizzes and test examinations and such. So how information is processed and then relayed. This is one of the least studied areas of the community of inquiry, and there's many ideas for research questions that could be approached using this method. However, it is a little bit more difficult to assess than some of the others would be. So in addition to cognitive presence, we also have social presence. And social presence is basically the emotional sense of belonging. There is an overlap of social presence with the other senses, or with the other presences. So when you feel a sense of social presence in an online course, oftentimes that comes from the teaching presence or the cognitive presence. So it does overlap quite significantly with the other two presences. There's three general dimensions of social presences according to Garrison in 2009. Basically, these three presences are as such: identifying with the community, and most often it's the community of those that are enrolled in the course, but it could be a community of those in a department or on a campus or associated with a particular regional area. It just depends on the course and the institution. Also, communicating purposely in a trusting environment. So as most people know, online education can be a bit risky for many folks. So the greater the sense of social presence, the more likely that it is that you are able to communicate and feel like you can trust that environment. In addition, developing interpersonal relationships. So formulating a connection between student and teacher, and such. So these are three major dimensions of social presences. In addition, there's a mediating variable between the cognitive and the teaching presences that is the job of the social presence. So when you have social presence, oftentimes your social presence is what mediates the cognitive and the teaching side of things. It sort of is the go-between. In order to be successful cognitively, oftentimes you have to feel connected to your course, to your teacher. And the teacher, in order to help you to feel connected, has to use some social presence attributes in order to keep you there. So it can be definitely a mediating variable. And it can influence cognitive and teaching presences. If the instructor desires to create a very close-knit community and a very strong, trusting environment and to build interpersonal relationships, the way in which they develop the course and deliver the course and maintain it will definitely influence the potential for cognitive presence by the students. So there's a mediating variable as well as an influential variable, although minor. Much research needs to be done to see how much of an impact it can have. The final presence is that of teaching presence, and this comes defined as such: design, facilitation, and direction of cognitive and social processes for the purpose of realizing personally meaningful and educationally worthwhile learning outcomes. So you have these three components in teaching presence, similar to what you did in social presence: design, facilitation, and direction. And these three dimensions are part of how a course is built, managed, and maintained. So designing the course in a way that fosters learning through course objectives and assignment creation, through activities, facilitating learning through discussions and announcements as such, and directing students through feedback and other forms of communication. So these three dimensions are all part of how the teacher is present, or the teaching presence within the course. So the question is, how do students differentiate between design, facilitation, and direction? Much of the research nowadays is showing that that's difficult for a lot of students and can be overlapping for instructors. Sometimes design, facilitation, and direction are intertwined, and other times they're very distinct. So that again is something to consider in terms of future research, is distinguishing these three dimensions if that's necessary. So those are the three presences. And with those three presences, they have done a ton of research. For the last 15, 16, 17 years, research has gone crazy in this area. Survey creation has been one of the most current forms of research for this. In the beginning, qualitative research was the sole methodology for discovering information about this particular theoretical framework. So they used, much of what they used was transcript analysis, and transcript analysis was done over and over and over again. It was done exhaustively, and then discovered that maybe they would want to go to a multi-methodological approach using both transcript analysis and case study or something along those lines. So they would combine various methods of research in order to get the information. Lately, they feel like there's just another piece to the puzzle that needs to be fit into it, and that is a more quantitative part of the research. So they in the past, looked straight at the presences themselves and how they are being distributed in the course. Now they're looking quantitatively with the desire to reach many more students and find some information that is on a larger scale. And with that, they look at the idea of perceptions of learners. So being able to perceive learners, being able to understand where the learners perceive themselves and their instructors and the course in terms of all these presences. So there is actually a series of questions that are associated with this survey, and they divide them by presences. This is linked here, and it shows the design and organization related to teaching presence, facilitation, direct instruction as such. And it continues on to look at various other components of the presences and how students might perceive. I can see this as a very useful resource for instructor evaluations and course evaluations at the end of a semester for online classes or hybrid classes, which is something that a lot of institutions are looking at, since there's quite a big distinction between the experiences students have in online courses versus that which they have in a face-to-face course. So survey creation is definitely something that's currently happening, but what about the future? What are the expectations for the future? Right now, they are looking to the future in the path of a predictor of learning processes and learning outcomes. So they're hoping that possibly, researchers in this area are hoping that possibly they can use the survey or other methods as a predictor of certain learning processes and learning outcomes in courses or full programs or in basic lifelong learning attitudes for just adult development and such, or faculty development. Researchers are also looking at potential future research questions, some of which are available in the research and others of which I personally find interesting. Here are a few that I, as far as my research goes, would find very fascinating to find the answers to. Number one, how does a student's perception of teaching presence impact the perceived and actual learning of that student? So this is something that I think would be most valuable qualitatively, but has the potential to make use of the survey that was created, because we are looking at a student's perception here. So we could get large numbers if needed. Another one I think would be interesting, and this would be honestly certainly impactful to my own personal experiences as well as many, many schools who are dealing with big dropout rates in online courses. So here's the question: is there a connection between the degrees of presences? So how much of one presence is available in the course? Is there a huge amount of social presence and a small amount of teaching presence, or vice versa, or something along those lines? And the student withdrawal or drop rate. So my question being, does a large social presence impact the course in a way in which it drops the amount of students that withdraw or drop from the course? Or is it vice versa? Do they need a much larger teaching presence in order to keep students from withdrawing or dropping from the course? Is there any connection or association or correlation between those things? And then also, is there a correlation between immediacy behaviors, both verbal and nonverbal, meaning things like nonverbal emoticons and exclamation points, anything like that that shows some kind of emotion, or verbal, emotional encouragement and such? Is there a correlation between those behaviors of the instructor and the cognitive, social, or teaching presences? So are those presences greater? For example, are social presences larger when there are teachers that use a lot of immediacy behaviors, or vice versa? And then finally, one more: how do instructor immediacy behaviors, like we mentioned earlier, impact the students' perceptions of teachers' social presence in a course? So does a student see a social presence as greater with the more immediacy behaviors that are used? All of these I find completely fascinating. As an online instructor myself, it's something that I want to find out more about and potentially look at this area for future research. Right now, two current studies that I find that are particularly interesting to me that are looking at this particular topic of immediacy behaviors is both done by Richardson et al., starting first in 2015 with conceptualizing and investigating instructor presence in online learning environments. They were looking at the conceptualization of instructor presence and the intersection of social and teaching presence as defined by the community of inquiry. The goal was to see what these online instructors saw as elements that worked together and find the proper and best use of time for those instructors in terms of their presence with that intersection of social and teaching. The second one was a follow-up from that, and that was Richardson et al. In 2016, which was the instructors' perceptions of instructor presence in online learning environments. As you can see, they're calling it something different: instructor presence. They define that as, again, the intersection between teaching and social. So there's that connecting piece that they see as the major foundation here. And the goal, the purpose of this study was to consider online instructors' perceptions related to presence, beliefs about actions, and the perceived impact of instructional presences. So it was a multiple case study. They looked at 13 instructors that were teaching online master's programs, and the results showed that instructors viewed instructor presence as an important component in online courses, but they had different reasons for their view of this. The instructors also shared a number of communication strategies that they used that they felt were important to engaging students. So it was quite fascinating to see how they approached this topic and this idea of an intersection or a midway between social presence and teaching presence. Hopefully that gives you a good overview of the community of inquiry theoretical framework. It is a largely impactful framework that has been present in much of the research of online education and continues to evolve and develop as the years go.